Hi everyone. Before this story takes its first real breath, let it be said plainly and boldly that what you are about to hear is not just a tale of workplace cruelty or quiet endurance. This is a reckoning. This is a reminder that power does not always announce itself loudly, and destiny does not always arrive dressed like permission. If this story moves you, challenges you, or reminds you of your own unseen worth, take a second to support the journey ahead. Like this story, subscribe for more and stand with voices that refuse to stay small. Now welcome to Black Queen Dominion. The building was quieter than it had ever been, the kind of silence that only existed when celebration was happening somewhere else. Christmas morning had dressed the city in soft lights and distant laughter, but inside the corporate tower, the glow came from fluorescent bulbs and computer screens left humming for no good reason. Floors above and below were empty, desks abandoned with half-wrapped gifts and coffee mugs still bearing traces of last week's warmth. Only one woman remained. She had arrived before sunrise, coat thin against the winter air, breath visible as she unlocked a door she should not have needed to touch that day. Her name was not on any executive list. Her face was not on any holiday card signed by leadership. To most of the people who worked there, she existed as function, not presence. She was the one who stayed late. The one who fixed problems quietly. The one whose competence was mistaken for obligation. She had been told, not directly but clearly enough, that Christmas was not for her. The explanation had been wrapped in professional language and polite indifference, but the meaning had landed sharp and heavy. She was needed. Others had families. Others had earned rest. Others were valued in ways that did not need to be defended. She was, as they had implied with careless certainty, just the black woman. Reliable. Replaceable. Invisible. Her workstation sat near a window that overlooked the street. From there she could see couples passing with wrapped boxes and red scarves, children tugging parents towards stores, and strangers exchanging smiles that came easily when joy felt allowed. Inside she adjusted spreadsheets, answered emails marked urgent by people who were no longer online, and completed tasks that could have waited but never did when assigned to her. She had learned long ago that resistance came at a price she could not yet afford. So she worked. She always worked. Excellence had been her shield, even when it became her cage. Each keystroke was precise. Each report flawless. Not because she was trying to prove anything anymore, but because failure had never been an option extended to her. As the hours passed, the building seemed to exhale its emptiness. Elevators stayed still. Phones stayed silent. The world outside moved on without her. She told herself that this day would pass like all the others, filed away as another sacrifice no one would remember. But fate had a way of interrupting assumptions. The phone rang once, sharp and sudden, slicing through the stillness. She paused, hand hovering for half a second, already knowing this call did not belong to her. No one ever called her directly. Calls were routed, filtered, delegated. This one had slipped through. When she answered, she did so with the calm professionalism that had been demanded of her since her first day. She expected a client complaint, a vendor confusion, or some last-minute crisis manufactured by poor planning. What she received instead was weight. 40. A presence that shifted the air in the room without raising its voice. The person on the other end was not supposed to reach her. Systems existed to prevent that. Layers of management stood between her desk and the highest level of the company. Yet somehow on Christmas morning the call had found her anyway. As she listened, understanding dawned slowly and then all at once. This was not a mistake. This was a test no one had prepared her for, but one she had been training for her entire life. The caller was asking questions that only someone who truly understood the company's inner workings could answer. Not theory. Not titles. Reality. Profits. Risks. Blind spots leadership had ignored because the people who saw them were never invited to speak. She responded with clarity, not urgency. With insight, not apology. She laid out truths that had lived in her notebooks and her mind for years. Truths she had shared upward only to see them dismissed, delayed, or diluted. Now they were landing where they mattered. The call stretched on minute by minute, reshaping a future that had felt immovable just hours earlier. Outside, the sky shifted from pale morning to cold afternoon, and still she stood there, steady, grounded, undeniable. She did not know yet that the voice on the other end was the CEO himself. She only knew that someone finally was listening. When the call ended, the silence returned, but it was different now. It no longer pressed down on her. It waited. She looked around the empty office, at the decorations she had helped hang but never enjoyed, at the chairs where managers would return tomorrow full of stories and leftovers. Nothing looked the same anymore. Something irreversible had been set in motion, and though she could not yet see the full shape of it, she felt it settling into place like truth finding its spine. By nightfall, Christmas lights reflected in the darkened windows, and the city outside glowed brighter than before. She shut down her computer, unaware that names were already being reconsidered, decisions rewritten, and assumptions shattered in rooms far above her pay grade. This was only the beginning. And when the morning came, the people who had left her behind would learn what it meant to underestimate a woman who had been carrying the company on her back. Christmas night arrived quietly, but its stillness carried consequence. The city outside the tower glittered with lights and movement, yet inside the executive floors, something restless had begun to stir. While families gathered and laughter echoed through warm homes, emails were being reopened, calendars pulled back up, and names re-examined with a seriousness that could not be postponed. The call that had slipped through the system earlier that day had not ended when the line disconnected. It had traveled upward, outward, and inward, forcing reflection where comfort had once lived. She did not know any of this yet. She left the building with measured steps, coat pulled tighter, breath steady. Years of being overlooked had taught her not to expect sudden miracles. She had learned to survive hope by keeping it small. Still, something followed her home that night, a quiet certainty that the ground beneath her had shifted. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way that demanded celebration. But in a way that could not be undone. At home the silence was gentler. A small space, carefully kept, decorated modestly for the season. A single strand of lights glowed near the window, not extravagant but intentional. She warmed food she had prepared days earlier, the kind of meal chosen for efficiency rather than indulgence. Christmas had never been a day off for her, not really. Even when she wasn't scheduled, her mind remained on call, trained by necessity to anticipate problems before they arrived. That night, however, her thoughts circled differently. The questions she had been asked during that call replayed themselves, not with anxiety but with recognition. Someone had finally seen the architecture of her mind. The way she understood systems. The way she noticed gaps others ignored. The way she carried institutional memory no handbook captured. For the first time, her value had not been translated through someone else's voice. Across town, the executive team gathered virtually, faces appearing one by one on glowing screens. This was not a meeting planned in advance. It was summoned. The tone was not celebratory. It was urgent. Performance metrics were pulled up, names attached to outcomes, and patterns that had been invisible suddenly stood exposed. The CEO, rarely surprised, had spent the afternoon reviewing reports with a new lens. He noticed how often her work appeared as the foundation beneath projects credited to others. How frequently her name appeared in internal correspondence tied to problem-solving moments. How consistently her role had been minimized in title but maximized in responsibility. Questions were asked that made people uncomfortable. Why had she been working alone on Christmas? Who had approved that decision? What criteria had been used to determine who deserved time off? Answers came wrapped in corporate language, but the hollowness was unmistakable. Justifications thinned under scrutiny. What had once been normalized now looked like neglect. Worse, it looked intentional. Meanwhile, she slept deeply for the first time in weeks. Not because her circumstances had changed, but because something inside her had unclenched. She did not dream of promotions or apologies. She dreamed of space. Of air. Of walking into rooms without bracing herself. Her body, long accustomed to vigilance, rested as though it sensed relief was approaching. Morning came slowly, pale light filtering through her window. December 26th carried no promise in her calendar. It was another workday. Another cycle. She dressed as she always did, with care that went unnoticed by most, and left her home with the same quiet resolve. She did not check her phone more than usual. She did not rehearse what's. Survival had taught her that expectation could be a liability. When she entered the building, something felt off. Not wrong but altered. Security nodded differently. Not warmer but attentive. Her badge scanned without issue, but the delay that usually followed, the subtle pause that suggested she didn't quite belong, was gone. Elevators arrived promptly. Lights were already on where they were usually dim. Her desk, once an island, now felt like a focal point. Emails began arriving before she logged in, flagged with urgency she had not been afforded before. She read them carefully, noticing the shift in tone. Less directive. More deferential. Requests instead of assumptions. She responded as she always had, thoroughly and without performance. Excellence did not change its rhythm simply because recognition arrived late. As the morning unfolded, managers returned from holiday break carrying leftovers and stories, laughter still clinging to their coats. They noticed her then, sitting exactly where she had been the day before. Some looked surprised. Others looked uneasy. A few looked away. Word had not reached them yet, but it was moving fast, carried not by gossip but by restructuring documents and calendar holds marked confidential. She sensed it before she saw it. The way conversations quieted when she passed. The way eyes followed her with calculation instead of dismissal. Years of being underestimated had sharpened her perception. She recognized the posture of people realizing they might have misjudged the balance of power. By midday, the first meeting invite appeared on her screen. Executive level. Mandatory. No explanation. Her name spelled correctly, title unchanged but placement significant. She did not rush. She finished what she was doing, saved her work, and stood with the same composure she had carried into every room that had never made space for her. The meeting room was larger than any she had entered before. Glass walls, polished surfaces, the kind of space reserved for decisions that shaped futures. She took her seat without hesitation, posture grounded, presence undeniable. She was not there to plead. She was there because the truth had finally arrived ahead of her. As faces filled the room, she recognized the tension. This was not a celebration. It was an accounting. The atmosphere held the weight of consequence, and though no words were exchanged yet, she understood something fundamental had changed. She was no longer on the margins of this story. She was at its center. Outside, Christmas decorations still hung in the lobby, cheerful and unaware. Inside, roles were being rewritten. And before the day ended, the people who had decided she was expendable would learn that the cost of their assumptions was far higher than they had imagined. The meeting began without ceremony, and that alone spoke volumes. There were no pleasantries, no seasonal greetings, no acknowledgments of time past or traditions observed. The room was sealed off from comfort, its glass walls reflecting faces that had grown accustomed to control but were now confronted with uncertainty. She sat among them not as an intruder but as an inevitability. Her presence no longer required explanation. Documents appeared on the screen, layered and methodical. Performance summaries. Operational flow charts. Email chains stretching back years. The story they told was not emotional, but it was devastating in its precision. It revealed a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or oversight. Her work stood at the center of critical successes, quietly reinforcing departments that would have collapsed without her intervention. Her insights, time-stamped and archived, preceded solutions later presented by others as their own. She watched as recognition dawned across the table in different ways. Some faces hardened, calculating exits or defenses. Others shifted into something closer to shame, though even that arrived late. A few tried to mask their discomfort behind professionalism, but the data refused to let them hide. Numbers did not flinch. Timelines did not soften. The CEO spoke then not to her directly but about her. About the call. About the clarity that had come from hearing the company described not from the top down, but from the ground up. He described how that call had revealed blind spots leadership had ignored because they had never believed the people living in them had anything worth saying. The room absorbed this in silence, each person measuring their own role in what had been allowed to persist. She did not interrupt. She did not nod. She did not offer gratitude. She understood that this moment was not about validation. It was about truth finally being allowed into the room. For years she had carried that truth alone, adjusting herself to fit systems that were never designed with her in mind. Now the system was being forced to adjust instead. One by one names were mentioned. Decisions questioned. Authority scrutinized. Why had her recommendations been stalled? Why had her title remained static while her responsibilities multiplied? Why had she been scheduled to work on Christmas while others were granted rest without question? Each inquiry peeled back another layer of convenience masquerading as policy. The discomfort in the room deepened. This was no longer about her alone. It was about culture. About whose labor was assumed and whose was protected. About how bias could hide behind productivity metrics and performance reviews, claiming neutrality while enforcing hierarchy. She felt something shift inside her as the conversation unfolded. Not vindication but release. The burden of proving her worth was lifting, not because she had suddenly become exceptional, but because the lie that she was ordinary was finally being exposed. She had always been this capable. The difference was that someone in power had finally decided to see it. By the time the meeting ended, decisions had been made that could not be undone quietly. Investigations would follow. Titles would be redefined. Reporting structures reimagined. Some roles would not survive the scrutiny they had long evaded. The room emptied more slowly than it had filled, people lingering as though proximity to her might offer protection or insight. She returned to her desk with the same calm she had carried into the meeting. But the atmosphere around her had transformed. Colleagues who once passed her without acknowledgement now hesitated, unsure how to approach her. Their greetings were tentative, their smiles strained. They sensed that she now held something they did not fully understand, a kind of authority that did not need to announce itself. Emails arrived in waves. Requests for clarification. Invitations to collaborate. Apologies that attempted sincerity but revealed more fear than reflection. She read them all, responding selectively. She was no longer obligated to smooth the discomfort of others. Her focus had narrowed to what mattered. Integrity, sustainability, and boundaries she would no longer negotiate away. As the day progressed, she noticed the absence of certain figures. Managers who had once hovered now remained unseen. Offices stayed dark. Calendars were cleared. The building itself seemed to hold its breath, aware that consequences were moving through its corridors. She took a moment that afternoon to step back from her screen and look out the window. The city moved as it always had, unaware of the small revolution unfolding several floors above. People hurried along sidewalks, chasing their own urgencies. Somewhere, families were still finishing holiday meals, children playing with new toys. Life continued, indifferent to corporate reckonings. Yet for her, everything had changed. She thought about the years she had swallowed frustration to survive. The meetings where she had spoken and been ignored, only to hear her ideas repeated later by someone else. The nights she had worked late, convincing herself that sacrifice was temporary. The holidays she had missed, the rest she had postponed, the parts of herself she had learned to quiet. None of it had been accidental. And none of it would be repeated. By late afternoon, another message arrived. This one was different. Direct. Clear. An invitation to a private discussion with the CEO before the end of the day. No intermediaries. No conditions. She accepted without hesitation. The office was quiet again when she stood to leave her desk, but this time the silence did not feel imposed. It felt earned. She walked toward the executive floor with steady steps, aware that she was no longer entering a space that belonged to someone else. She was entering a future that was finally beginning to recognize her authority. What awaited her behind that door was not just opportunity. It was accountability. And the people who had built their comfort on her invisibility were about to learn that survival without her would not be guaranteed. The executive floor was quieter than she expected, not with emptiness but with restraint. The kind of quiet that followed disruption when systems paused to reassess themselves. She walked down the corridor lined with framed mission statements and photographs of past leadership, all faces that had benefited from structures they never questioned. Her reflection moved alongside them in the glass, steady and unflinching, a presence history had failed to anticipate. The CEO's office door was open when she arrived. Inside, the space was minimal, deliberate, free of the clutter that often masked indecision. He stood as she entered, not as a gesture of courtesy but of acknowledgement. This was not a meeting where power would be asserted through posture. It was a reckoning that required humility, and he understood that much. The conversation that followed was measured and direct. He spoke of oversight and institutional failure without defensiveness. He named the ways the company had leaned on her labor while denying her authority. He admitted that the systems designed to reward merit had instead protected familiarity and comfort. This was not an apology seeking absolution. It was a recognition seeking correction. She listened without interruption, absorbing not just the words but the intent behind them. She had heard apologies before, many of them eloquent, most of them empty. This was different. This carried consequence. Offers were laid out clearly without embellishment. A new role, designed around her actual contributions rather than a sanitized job description. Authority that matched responsibility. Compensation that acknowledged years of undervaluation. Most importantly, the power to reshape the processes that had allowed bias to masquerade as efficiency. She did not respond immediately. Silence, she knew, could be as instructive as speech. She considered the weight of what was being placed before her, not as reward but as responsibility. Accepting would mean staying within a system that had harmed her. Declining would mean walking away from influence that could prevent that harm from continuing. Neither choice was simple. Both required courage. When she finally spoke, her response was grounded and unromantic. She did not frame her acceptance as gratitude. She framed it as commitment. A commitment to transparency, to equity, to ensuring that no one else would be forced to prove their humanity through exhaustion. She made her conditions clear, not as demands but as non-negotiables. Structural change was not optional. Accountability would not be selective. Representation would be meaningful or it would be meaningless. The agreement that followed was not sealed with smiles or handshakes for the cameras. It was documented, signed, and scheduled for immediate implementation. The CEO understood that credibility would be earned not through announcements but through action. She left the office not triumphant but resolved. Word traveled quickly after that. Not through official channels at first, but through the subtle shifts that followed, authority realigning itself. Access changed. Decision-making paths rerouted. Meetings were restructured. The names that had once dominated conversations were suddenly absent, replaced by interim placeholders or vacant lines on org charts. Investigations concluded faster than expected. Findings were not buried. Those who had benefited most from her silence felt the shift acutely. Some reached out with messages heavy with regret and light on accountability. Others attempted to position themselves as allies, rewriting their own histories in the process. A few, sensing the ground giving way beneath them, asked for forgiveness as though it were a currency she was obligated to distribute. She did not respond to most of them. Forgiveness, she knew, was not a prerequisite for justice. Healing did not require her to minimize the harm she had endured. She focused instead on the work ahead, on building systems that did not depend on exceptional resilience to function fairly. As days passed, the company began to feel unfamiliar to those who had once navigated it with ease. Policies were reviewed through lenses that had long been ignored. Metrics were redefined. Leadership training expanded to include accountability not as a concept, but as a practice. Some employees struggled to adapt. Others flourished, relieved to find that excellence no longer required erasure. She moved through this transformation with steady intention. She mentored without performing emotional labor. She led without replicating the rigidity that had once constrained her. Her presence reshaped rooms not through force but through clarity. People learned quickly that she did not tolerate performative progress. Outcomes mattered. Impact mattered. Late one evening, as the building emptied again, she stood by the window where this story had begun. The city lights reflected back at her, brighter now, less distant. She thought of the woman who had stood there on Christmas morning, working through silence, believing she was alone. That woman had not been weak. She had been waiting. Now the people who had dismissed her understood what waiting had cost them. Jobs had been lost. Reputations damaged. Careers rerouted without ceremony. The company had survived but not unchanged. It would never again be able to pretend that talent looked one way or came from one place. Forgiveness was still being asked for in quiet corners and carefully worded messages. But she had learned that not every wound required reconciliation. Some required remembrance. And as the year turned and the last traces of holiday decorations were packed away, one truth stood unshaken. She had not risen to power to avenge herself. She had risen to make sure no one else would be forced to earn dignity through suffering. The building no longer felt the same in the early mornings. Where once there had been a hollow stillness that implied exclusion, there was now a sense of purpose, quiet but intentional. People arrived with clarity instead of caution. Meetings began on time, not out of fear but out of respect. The transformation was not cosmetic. It was structural, and it carried her imprint in ways no plaque or announcement could fully capture. She no longer occupied the margins of the organization. Her office sat where strategy lived, not because she needed visibility but because access mattered. From there, she guided conversations that reshaped priorities and redefined success. She listened more than she spoke, but when she spoke, people paused. Not because she demanded silence, but because she had earned trust. Her leadership did not rely on intimidation or spectacle. It relied on consistency. The company's culture began to recalibrate around principles that had once been treated as optional. Equity was no longer an initiative. It was embedded. Accountability was no longer a threat. It was expected. People learned that excellence did not require exhaustion and that innovation flourished when voices were not filtered by bias. The systems she helped build did what systems were always meant to do: distribute opportunity instead of hoarding it. Her impact extended beyond the walls of the building. Recruitment strategies changed. Mentorship pipelines expanded. Partnerships formed with institutions that had long been overlooked. The company's reputation shifted not because of marketing campaigns, but because people felt the difference. Employees spoke openly about belonging, about being seen, about finally working in a place where potential was not prejudged. She did not forget where she came from. She carried those memories not as wounds but as reference points. When decisions were debated, she remembered the cost of being excluded. When budgets were reviewed, she remembered the price of invisibility. Her leadership was informed by experience, not detached from it. From time to time, she received messages from former colleagues who had been forced to reckon with their own actions. Some expressed genuine growth. Others sought closure without accountability. She responded only when it aligned with her values. Her energy was no longer available for managing other people's guilt. She had learned that progress did not require her to carry the emotional weight of those who had benefited from her silence. On the anniversary of that Christmas, the company closed its offices without exception. Not as a gesture but as policy. Rest was no longer something to be earned through hierarchy. It was recognized as essential. She spent that day away from the city, walking beneath open sky, reflecting on how far she had come without losing herself. She did not mark the day with bitterness. She marked it with gratitude for her own resilience and for the truth that had finally found its voice. Her story began to circulate, not as a cautionary tale but as a blueprint. People spoke of her leadership in rooms she had never entered, and her influence reached places she had never planned to go. Young women saw themselves reflected in her journey, not as symbols of struggle but as architects of change. She became proof that dignity did not have to be deferred and that power could be reshaped without being corrupted. The company thrived, but more importantly, it learned. It learned that overlooking brilliance had consequences. It learned that diversity without equity was decoration. It learned that silence was never neutral. These lessons were hard-won, but they endured because they were rooted in truth. She stood once more by the window where everything had shifted, watching the city move with its familiar urgency. The reflection staring back at her was not hardened by victory or softened by forgiveness. It was grounded. Whole. She had not been transformed by power. Power had been transformed by her. The woman who had once been made to work on Christmas because she was seen as expendable had become indispensable, not because of title or authority, but because of the integrity she brought into every space she entered. The people who had dismissed her now spoke her name with respect, not out of fear but out of recognition. Her legacy was not built on revenge. It was built on restoration. On systems made fairer. On voices amplified. On futures altered quietly but permanently. She had risen not to dominate but to lead. And in doing so she proved what they had never understood. He was never just the black woman. He was the standard.